go to West Virginia, meaning Marshall, which is located in West Virginia. Let's talk about Tony Gibson. All right. Who is this guy? Right? Gibby. All right. Who is this guy? I mean, this guy was the defensive coordinator at NC State this past season and several seasons before that. Marshall fans, I'm never going to be the guy that says, hey, you fans should feel a particular way about something. But I will say I was a little bit disappointed with some of the reactions from Marshall fans regarding Tony Gibson, particularly pertaining to his tenure at NC State. If you listen to us talk about it, they didn't have the talent to compete this year at all. And part of that's on Tony Gibson, for sure. Absolutely. But what he did with that defense, those 4 years prior to this past season, were absolutely unbelievable. So to just see blanket comments of people saying, oh, yeah, Tony Gibson, his defenses at NC State were terrible. What are you talking about? That dude knows how to coach football on the defensive side of the ball.
Which, by the way, be grateful, too, because you're getting him at a discount. You're getting him at a good value right now, because if he had continued his trend of how good those defenses were performing, NFL draft, recruiting, statistically, all that kind of stuff in the ACC, like, with all due respect, and let's be honest here, like, he would be at a Power 4 job right now and other stuff, or maybe he'd be hired away at an Ohio State, Penn State, some other programs that are putting big-time money into their defensive coordinator spot, because we know how important that can be. He was phenomenal there. Obviously, recency bias will have you there, but look at the whole tenure. Look at what he's done in all of his staffs, all he has done all the way back to his time at West Virginia, knowing the state, being from here, right? A native, of West Virginia, and he's coming back to Huntington. I mean, I get the idea outside looking in, like it was quote unquote the easy hire. I think some fans have thrown around lazy hire because he is a West Virginia native, and maybe it was a layup there, but sometimes the obvious choice is the right choice too. And honestly, I could see your skepticism in, your administration because of what's happened in the past with guys like Doc Holliday, with guys like Charles Huff, and the way those ended, in their tenures, in their very successful tenures, by the way, maybe not be too inspiring, to your confidence in getting this higher right, but it's a new AD, right? You're in a new conference here in the Sun Belt. You just had massive success there. You're going to see some recruiting issues, all that kind of stuff. And with the investment you're putting into this coaching staff and the coaching salary, like, you're going to have an opportunity to see some returns. And, obviously, we like Gibson. Is it going to work out? Obviously, who knows? And we're just going to, give our thoughts here and try to predict that out, but also, understand that these grades are going to happen with expectations and other things that are involved, not just who Tony Gibson is, as a coach.
I love this guy. All right. Like, if there's one thing too, like, there was some speculation out there, and it's fair to speculate, I mean, maybe it's not fair to the people that we're speculating about, but it's fair to speculate that, hey, maybe he didn't have a great season. He didn't like the trajectory, of his spot at the defensive coordinator position at NC State. Sometimes it's good to hit the reset button. All right. You see that, all the time with basketball coaches, football coaches, people mostly talk about it for head coaching positions, but it also works like that for coordinator positions as well. But like, I don't think that's that. Like he talked about it in his interview that there was another job that was available. It was a Power 4 job that was available. He didn't mention the name of the school or whatever, but he said that there was another university that reached out to him about a job. And he came to Marshall, taking a pay cut from what he was getting at NC State to be back in his home state at a place that he cares a lot about, a place that he grew up an hour away from, right? $500,000 pay cut to be here. And I don't think he'd be doing that if he didn't think he could win. I don't think he'd be doing it if he didn't want to be there. And I don't think that he would do it if it wasn't so geographically him. Like, if the fit wasn't there, like, just the way that he speaks, right? Like, he seems very genuine. He seems very, and I could be wrong about all this, right? But he seems very genuine. He seems very outspoken. He seems like he's ready to tell you the truth. He's a pretty funny guy. Seems outgoing. I think players like him a lot. Sure, okay. He's never been a head coach, okay? I saw a lot of Marshall fans knocking him for this reason. He's never been a head coach before. Okay, sure. So was Huff a head coach before he was hired at Marshall? Answer me. Was he a head coach before that? No, but he was. You could definitely argue that he was more ready. Okay, I mean, literally was learning under Saban at the time. But am I right in that? He was with Alabama.
Yeah.
And then two, like what we talked about, is NC State defenses were bad. They just were not. Right. Now the question here is, it's like, do you think he's actually going to meet expectations? Like, that's what you should be asking yourself as a Marshall fan. Like, do I think that he can meet expectations? And then identify what those expectations are. Because Doc Holliday won CUSA Coach of the Year, and his contract was not renewed. All right, before Charles Huff was hired. Okay, and then also too, it seemed like that this was a plan for a while too by the AD to hire Tony Gibson, because they knew for a while. The AD Spears, he said that they had offered a contract extension to Huff. All right. This is a direct quote from him. He said, "When I first got hired, I learned that Coach Huff was interviewing for jobs." This was back when he was hired in 2022. Okay. He and his representatives have been transparent since day one on his interview opportunities, which is good for Huff and his team. We did offer an extension following the 2022 season that was turned down. So he knew that Huff was potentially at the door in any given year, and he had a list of candidates because he had to. Right? He had to have a list of candidates ready to go. And it feels like Tony Gibson was potentially one of the top guys on his list. And, I'll trust it, man. I'll trust it. But we just have to establish what those expectations are, right? Because it seems like that they may be Spears' expectations and fans' expectations and our expectations could all be different, right? We don't know. Like, I just, this is a really good team. They've had good rosters the past couple of years. They've had success with Doc Holliday. They've had success with Huff. People are going to be expecting success from Tony Gibson in a very competitive conference where you have Sunbelt teams that have really good and underrated coaches, right? From top to bottom. I mean, the worst team in the Sunbelt this past year was what? Southern Miss? And now Charles Huff is their coach who just won the Sunbelt, right? And then Lou Monroe, you hire Brian Vincent, and then all of a sudden you're winning ball games there with an unbelievable offense, which we talked about this time last year, how Brian Vincent's offense could save that program top to bottom, right? I mean, Del McGee, we'll see. Right? But generally, top to bottom, in the Sun Belt, you're liking everything that you're seeing there, and there's a lot of talent. There's a lot of resources in terms of the competitive advantages from certain teams. There's more parity in the Sun Belt than there is in other conferences.
Well, yeah, if you remember, Marshall fans, like, it all happened very quickly. Obviously, there were rumors circulating about, if Charles Huff was going to stay with Marshall, his contract hadn't been extended. What's going on there? They win the title, right? The Sunbelt title. The next morning, all of a sudden, he's heading to Southern Miss. Boom! Not long after, on the same day, Tony Gibson was announced as going to Marshall. So obviously, there was a plan in place there. They got their guy. No surprises there. I'm going to trust that too. You mentioned, the pay cut that, our guy Gibby is going to be taking. Let's talk about the contract details and why this gives me confidence in this administration here. So it's a 6-year deal, big time investment there, especially in the G5, especially in a spot where you don't know what's going on, with revenue sharing. You don't know what's going on in conference realignment, in TV deals, media deals. Like, everyone in their mother in the athletic departments everywhere across college athletics are scrambling to find money. The fact that you have that commitment to that is fantastic. You're going to get a chance to match that $1,500, $1.5 million in incentive bonuses. Now, he probably won't get all of those because some of that stuff is like, big time aspirations that are in most head coaching contracts, but never really met there, or only met by one head coach, but winning a national title. But anyways, he's going to get almost $2 million for his assistant coaching staff and support staff. That's a plenty competitive number in the Sun Belt there. Charles Huff, who took the job at Southern Miss, is actually going to be getting paid less than Tony Gibson, right? He's going to be getting just under that 1 million mark, which I think, by the way, it's probably, I wonder if it's a little bit on purpose there, that they just gave Gibby a little bit more than what Huff got at Southern Miss. Huff will have, a larger salary pool, but regardless, for his staff, it's still pretty comparable there. But to me, it gives you like incentive. It gives you opportunity and investment in the program, which is fantastic. I want to ask you this here. If you're a Marshall fan, right, it obviously hurts to watch your coach walk out and go to what has been seen as, a less competitive team, right, that they fielded recently over there in Southern Mississippi, and watch your coach walk over there. And it's like, well, what's going on? Like, obviously it hurts. You lose your coach, it's happy, sad because you just won the title, but it's got to be a weird feeling there. We don't see that very often with coaches leaving in the conference to go to a team, that had just won. Like, how often is that going to be happening? Is this a good job in the Sun Belt? Obviously you can have success here, which we've seen in CUSA. We've seen with Charles Huff in the Sun Belt. Like, you look at assistant coaching or coaching pay, that $1 million. If you go back to last year's statistics, and obviously they'll get updated, some coaches will get some raises and whatnot, but that would put you at third in the Sun Belt in head coach salary, more than competitive. Do you think, how good of a job is this in the Sun Belt? Is this top half, top quarter, right? It's somewhere around there.
I'd say top half probably.
Yeah.
And really that's just like from a resource allocation standpoint. Yeah. That's not from a fan base standpoint, right? And tradition standpoint, because I also think about that too, right? Yeah. And every coach is different in terms of fit as well. But I think from just specifically a resource allocation and resource availability, it's top half.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why Tony Gibson obviously left a pretty good paying job and not an easy job, but an easier job for sure than being a G5 head coach, especially now more than ever. Let's talk about what he's done, right? So, Tony Gibson is a defensive guy. Obviously, we know that. You know that if you're a college football fan, been following on the East Coast there in the ACC, but he started all the way back, got his FBS start, being a DB coach at West Virginia in Morgantown, not far away. Obviously, big rivals there, Marshall and West Virginia, but he has a big time connection to Rich Rod, who's also back in the state there, which will be really fun to see that connection. But he followed Rich Rod over to Michigan as well, was their DB coach, assistant head coach, all that kind of good stuff. Brief stint in Pittsburgh before reuniting with Rich Rod, back in Arizona, and then ended up in West Virginia and stayed on, the East Coast there, West Virginia, safeties coach, defense coordinators, linebackers, and then also did the same thing there with NC State, coaching, being a defense coordinator and coaching safeties and linebackers in certain years. So he brings that defensive, mindset. Obviously, you mentioned, and some of the fans have mentioned too, he has never been a head coach before. Is that worrisome? Probably a little bit, but also it's not like we haven't seen guys have success right away, just because they're coming from a coordinator. And also, if your job like Marshall, like, let's be honest too, like, you're going to have to take some risks. Like Zach Kitley over in FAU, like, that's a risk, and it could pay out huge. It could be very terrible. It's a 30-some-year-old coach. It's barely been a coordinator, barely, been around in college football, and all of a sudden he's a head coaching job there. So you're going to take some risks here. We've seen it work out. We've seen it not work out. Obviously you had the position coach hire in – not even a coordinator, position coach hire in Charles Huff. Obviously at Alabama – is his own thing there, the school and the factory that Nick Saban.
He was the assistant head coach too. Like when he was there, like he was a big dog for sure.
But Gibson's been that with Rich Rod, assistant head coach, a couple times there. Dave Doran has had a ton of success in North Carolina State there. So it's just super interesting. And the last thing I'll throw in too with the Rich Rod and West Virginia, I'm sure our Marshall fans will be wondering about that rivalry there. And from what I've heard, it doesn't sound like it'll get brought up, even though they're good friends. Rich Rod and Tony Gibson going way back there. But it's just, I think with everything going on right now financially, with revenue sharing and conference realignment, same reasons why we're seeing a lot of athletic departments kind of panic and, start to really be budget friendly, like throwing away that revenue with West Virginia, having to go play away in Huntington. Like that is revenue you are missing out from just hosting, a random FCS or, a Coastal Carolina or App State or someone else there, to Troy, another Sun Belt school, to come and visit them. So I think part of that's why it's not really going. I've heard Marshall is open for a 2-for-1 split. So every 2 games that West Virginia hosts at home, Marshall gets 1. Still did not really budge. So you might have to go to a 3-to-1 or even worse. But I, for one, would love to see that rivalry back. I think it will be more competitive than it has been in the past. And obviously, Marshall has never won, and they haven't played since 2012, but we've seen Marshall put together some pretty good teams since then. I mean, in 2013, they won 10 games, 3 straight years, and then obviously winning the Sun Belt there. So it would be a lot of fun to see that. And obviously, West Virginia, we are excited about the Rich Rod hire. Who knows how it's going to work out? It's obviously you're not your 2007, right? West Virginia teams, 2006 teams, or even, the Geno Smith era there, towards the end. But yeah, it's super interesting there. Obviously, a lot to talk about with Tony Gibson and his West Virginia connections and where he grew up and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so Charles Huff has a lot of connections in terms of being able to bring in his staff. I saw it on the notes that you have here placed in front of me that he does have a larger salary pool for his assistants at Southern Miss than Tony Gibson will have at Marshall, but it doesn't seem to be that much.
No, and honestly, it's an interesting staff. You've got a lot of flavor from Rich Rod, which is really interesting offensively, which is nice because, and we'll get into this, but we always talk about this where you have these coaches who typically grow up on one side of the ball, right? Rich Rod, offensive guy, Charles Huff, offensive guy, Tony Gibson, defensive guy, right? So you trust him to get his side of the ball right, trust his hires. He usually has his, his little posse, or not posse, but he's got his, group and his close-knit. Yeah, his people that have been working under his wing for a while now that he's pretty familiar with. It's the other side of the ball that he has to nail. And those are the big time hires. Yeah. I mean, it will be really interesting to see. So if I can get into it here, offensively, the offensive coordinator is going to be Rod Smith. Again, this is that Rich Rod flavor. He was the OC and quarterback coach for Rich Rodriguez at Jacksonville State the past couple years. He was also with him, I believe, at Michigan, where he did cross over with Tony Smith there. Also, by the way, was at Illinois, and a bad Illinois roster he did a lot with. That was really, really impressive, I thought, too. They are pretty multiple. Obviously, Rich Rod loves to run the football, so he has that flavor behind him. But he's also played with some dynamic quarterbacks, super fast-paced offense.
Did you mention that Rod Smith and Gibson played together in college?
I did not know that. No.
Yeah. They did, but they both played at Glenville State in West Virginia.
Look at that. Well done.
So look, you like continuity, you like fit. Those are things you like to see. So they know each other well. They're clearly friends. Rich Rod flavor. I don't know. I like it.
Why not? And also, too, so he's bringing in the quarterback from Jacksonville State. There's Zion Turner, who was the backup this year to Tyler Huff, who was all conference stud down there in the CUSA. Turner was okay at UConn, not great, as a true freshman, but he's not a huge running threat, which we've seen, Rich Rod and Rod Smith kind of have success with, but he did have 90 carries there. You also have Carlos Del Rio, a guy that's a little bit more athletic, wasn't very good at Syracuse at all, but we'll see what happens there, getting into maybe a little bit better system. The O-line coach, moving on, we love the connection between the OC and the O-line coach. Bob McCain is going to be the guy. Another native to West Virginia, right? We love that. Was Rod Smith with Rich Rod there at West Virginia, coaching at Pennsylvania, California D2 school. Past couple seasons was also at Illinois O-line coach there, so having some crossover with Rod Smith. Has also been in App State back when they were at FCS, and he coached with Gibson as well when they were on the West Virginia staff. So obviously you've got that connection there. Head coach, OC, O-line coach. Love that symmetry there. Running backs coach is Rod McDowell. He was with Rod Smith the past couple seasons at Jacksonville State. He was also with ULM with Rod Smith and Rich Rod, before that, before they went to Jacksonville State. He played running back, if that's a familiar name for you on the East Coast there, played running back at Clemson and was a 1,000-yard rusher there in 2013. Marshall has had a history recently of having elite running backs, right? Rasheen Ali, Kalen LeBourne, AJ Turner, right? Continue that vibe there with Rod McDowell. Would love to see that. Tight ends coach is Gunter Brewer. A lot of wide receiver work in his background. Virginia Tech, Maryland, Louisville, UNC, Oklahoma State has a lot of success there, working with some big time, receivers there. Obviously, Justin Blackman with Oklahoma State and some other guys. He also coached for a year in the NFL with the Eagles. Originally has coached at Marshall before from 1996 to 1999. If you're a Marshall fan of that decade, you remember a guy named Randy Moss coming through your program there. Obviously, we know the Hall of Fame or the story about him in Huntington and all the success he had. You got to credit Gunter Brewer with some of that there. So you love him coming back home. The wide receivers coach is going to be Chansey Stuckey. He was Notre Dame the past couple seasons. Ironically, was there when Marshall beat them a couple years ago, and part of that was because the wide receiver core maybe wasn't getting much separation at all. So we'll look with this. Obviously, try not to look with too much green colored glasses, but this is an interesting hire there. He's with Baylor, also G at Clemson. Was at Clemson when Rod McDowell was working there. So after Rod McDowell was playing, he was there working, with Stuckey there. So we'll see what happens there on the offense side. But yeah, like we said, this is an important side of the ball for our guy Gibby to hit on.
Yeah, and look, if you don't believe in Rod Smith, I would say let's take a guy that's highly respected in the college football world, and let's take his word for it. So Robert Anae, who's the offensive coordinator at North Carolina State, okay, maybe hasn't had the greatest last couple seasons, but has had very good tenures at other. Yeah, he's got way up here, right? And so he worked at Arizona, right, with Rich Rod and Rod Smith. He also worked at Virginia with Rod Smith for a year, and then obviously Robert Anae worked with Tony Gibson at NC State these last 2 years. And at Virginia, Robert Anae was getting interviewed about, being in this kind of system, and he's like, being asked about that 2012 season with Arizona, and he said, quote, "That year at Arizona with Rod Smith, Rich Rodriguez, and Calvin McGee, every day was Christmas for me. I'd been in one system for playing and coaching for forever, right? Decades. And this guy was 66 years old, done a lot of coaching. He's like, and now I get to go to work and be in a different type of system, a system where where your quarterback is not just that handoff guy, but a threat everywhere. Man, and every day I took so many notes. I was a sponge, and in the process, I got to make some really good friends." So a guy like Robert Anae was learning from guys like Rod Smith, if that tells you anything. So I think I'm just saying we know that they work well together. I believe in Rod Smith. It's going to be a very interesting offense, but I think it's one that works at that level for sure.
It's also one that Gibson is familiar working with. Sometimes you have offenses that are hard to play defense as in complementary, they just aren't. And so obviously Gibson has that experience playing opposite a Rich Rodriguez, themed offense. And obviously there are worse coaches offensively to model your tree after on the offensive side of the ball. Defensively, right, this is Gibson's side of the football. Defense coordinator is going to be Shannon Morrison, right? So that's going to be a familiar name for our Marshall fans. He was with Marshall from 2021 to 2023 as their linebacker coach. Marshall had a pretty damn good defense for him. He was also with Marshall a couple times there, 2005, 2008, 95, 97. So a little bit of crossover there with, the wide receiver coach, or the tight end coach, Gunter Brewer. He was also, at a captain for the Marshall team, in the 90s as well. Has worked for Eastern Kentucky, Ball State. So he's got Bowling Green. So he's got some of that MAC experience, as well as Cincinnati and Memphis. Defensive line coach is Ralph Street, another familiar name to our Marshall fans. Has been at Marshall for 4 years now as the D-line coach. Let's talk about some defensive line he's coached. Mike Green, right, potential first-round pick. Elijah Alston, Owen Porter, Sam Burton, names you remember, all Sunbelt kind of guys there. He was also at FAMU, Florida A&M, with Willie Simmons, a guy we love Willie Simmons down there and what he can do at FIU, as well as a couple of stops in the SWAC with Prairie View A&M and Alcorn State. A Marshall alum, right, team captain for him. He was all MAC back when they were, in the MAC in 2001. Linebacker coach is going to be Jake Ellsworth. This is Tony Gibson's, one of his right-hand man, was with him for 5 years at NC State coaching linebackers. You're talking about Peyton Wilson. You're talking about Drake Thomas, some big-time linebackers coming through that pipeline there. Was also at Illinois for 7 seasons. This is only his 3rd team he's been with. So obviously, he's been under that Tony Gibson kind of mantra for a while now. DB coach Jared Hawley. He was at Abilene Christian this past season coaching safeties. Prior to that was coaching DBs, or cornerbacks more specifically, at James Madison. You're talking about the year that they were really freaking good a couple years ago. D'Angelo Pons, Chauncey Logan. You Sunbelt fans remember those two. I was also the DB coach at North Texas and Albany before that. I was a captain at Pittsburgh as all Big East, right? Big East safety back from 08 to 2012, playing for Gibson, right? When Gibson was at Pittsburgh in 2011. So you love that connection there. And lastly, I'll finish up with special teams. Jackson White, he was special teams quality control analyst at NC State. You're talking about familiarity with, Tony Gibson. He also had, Lou Groza Award winner for the best kicker, nation's best long snapper back in 2013, the Patrick Manelli Award. White was a Marshall alum. He was a backup quarterback here from 2016 to 2019, was the holder, right, for the special teams unit. So obviously he knows in and out that operation there. Obviously spent a lot of time with some specialists. And he also coached DBs at South Carolina under Will Muschamp, who's known for having some good special teams down there. So yeah, it's an interesting staff here. I think defensively, special teams wise, obviously one you trust, Gibson to get right, but he's got some flavor of Marshall, guys that have success here. He's got some flavor at North Carolina State. He's got some alumni. It's kind of like this full circle thing. On paper, looks great. We'll see how it works in the season.
Yeah, and like fans, Marshall defenses, I think, with the exception of 2023, that Marshall fans can expect generally a good defense. Like they're expecting for this side of the ball not to dip, particularly hiring Tony Gibson. I mean, look, Lance Guidry, right? Jason Seymour both did really good jobs at Marshall. Really good jobs. I mean, we saw Lance Guidry get hired after that 2020 season where they were like the best defense in the country in terms of opponent points per game. But yeah, Tony Gibson, I think if he's going to win over the fans, I think he needs to get this side of the ball right, and I trust him to do that. But yeah, with that and liking the staff that he put together on the offensive side of the ball, I think it's pretty solid. I think it fits well. I think there's some continuity from, last Marshall, like you talked about, for a first-time head coach to have people in the building that are familiar with the traditions and the people there and the connections that you can make. I think it's important to have sometimes that kind of staff in your building with you, and then not to mention bringing in some of that Rich Rod flavor on offense. So I do think that, and we always talk about this for staffs, like you don't know, right? You don't know how it's going to work. You don't know who's going to move from year to year. But for a year one staff, this looks like a pretty decent job that Tony Gibson has done.
Things in year one you want to do, right? Set a culture, right? So you want to have guys familiar and have like-minded in terms of values and other things, setting a tone there for your team in year one, trying to establish an identity and culture. Check on that on paper. And two, you want to recruit well. Huff actually recruited really, really well. Now his actual class rankings weren't always the highest because they only signed over 20 players once, right? And that was when they did, they actually were first ranked in the Sun Belt back in 2012 or 2022. So I want to see how this staff and Gibson especially does recruiting wise and how they take advantage of the success and the momentum that's been built up for them at Marshall.
Yeah, I like this hire. I mean, are you ready to get into like more expectations and giving a grade?
Let's get into it. Yeah.
So expectations. All right. I think this is a huge conversation that we have to have, right? 2020 was that 2020. Doc Holliday goes 7-3, wins Coach of the Year in the CUSA, doesn't get a contract extension renewal. And I think the decision was made, prior to that season. Like it was kind of in the making.
And COVID happened too. Remember that was
and just that whole thing, whatever. But that to me just suggests that the expectations for at least that administration, right, were exceptionally high, right? And then their expectations were met, which also ultimately having a double-digit win season, winning the Sun Belt for a year. I just don't know if those are my expectations now. Like should they be competitive year in and year out? Like on the verge of, maybe by week 10, you're still in competing, trying to win that Sun Belt division that you're in. I just don't have the same expectations that I think now that you've had the flavor of winning the Sun Belt. Like, I don't think that drastically changes my expectations, but I do think that maybe the fans' expectations are a little bit higher than my expectations for this program. So for that reason, like when we're grading these guys, an A is if a coach is going to exceed expectations. All right. B is if they're going to meet them, and a C is if they're not going to meet expectations. And we've never given out a D as a grade. I'm inclined to give him this higher B minus, and I just talked about. You're like, what a terrible grade, and because I just talked about how much I love Tony Gibson. As a person, what he's done for his coaching staff, what it looks like he's done, his history, coaching the defensive side of the ball, his history with Rich Rod, his West Virginia ties. This feels like a dang good fit. Is he going to meet those expectations though? I don't know. I'm not super confident that he's going to just have 10-win seasons and win the Sun Belt. I don't know that he's going to do that. But that doesn't mean he won't have a successful career there as a coach, And if he's not recruiting at a super high level and he's not, having those top 40 defenses, because that's what Marshall fans are accustomed to, is top 40 defenses, and the Sun Belt keeps getting stronger and stronger every single year. I just think it's hard for me to definitively say, yes, he's going to exceed expectations. So I'm going to give a conservative B minus here. And hopefully I eat my words. And hopefully we look back on this and we're like, yeah, that was an A+ hire because of the fit, because of his ties to West Virginia, because of we saw the coaching staff that he brought in. It looked like it was really effective on paper, and it turns out it was. And they got a program kind of there with a lot of folks that are ready to win and know how to win, and administration that is very aligned. I think Christian Spears was very excited about this hire, and I think those two are going to get along really well. But I'll give it a B minus.
Yeah, the expectation conversation is really interesting. To me, it reminds me, going back to UMass, we talked about Joe Harasimiak and what the expectations for UMass have been historically, and then what he got paid, and telling
and the conference that they just moved to.
When you are making, $200,000 more than anybody else in your conference, to me, that makes big time expectations for you with UMass, regardless of what, your history has been there. At Marshall, obviously the expectations are high, and you're also paying him top 3, top 4 level money, so that you're going to expect, success and absolutely. And looking through, your division, because the Sun Belt, we love the Sun Belt. We love the Sun Belt. We cover that a ton during the season. You still have divisions, right? Which is fantastic, by the way. But you're competing with James Madison, right? Old Dominion, who somehow won 5 games and had an unbelievable power rating.
Ricky.
Coastal Carolina, and Tim Beck there. App State getting Dowell Loggins. Obviously, Georgia Southern there with Helton there, and what they can do and be streaky, over there in almost Savannah. So
we were, what was it, week 9, and we were like, who's going to win the Sun Belt this year?
Yeah.
It was toss up. Louisiana was in the other division, but
we
were like,
ODU,
what's going on?
James Madison, Georgia Southern, they were all right up there. Coastal Carolina, I think, had a chance at some point, but it's really interesting. To me, the expectation, right, is obviously going to bowl games, right, competing in the Sun Belt. You don't have to win it every year, but be in the conversation, like you said, come November. And I want to see you recruit well too, because, you can, and I think in the Sun Belt, obviously with stuff changing, it's going to be harder potentially, but I think you still can have good classes put together. I'm going to go B+, just because, even though the expectations are high, I just think you've seen a lot of success at Marshall. And honestly, Tony Gibson, to me, seems a little bit more prepared than potentially Charles Huff and what he's walking into. I'm super excited about this hire. Obviously, if I'm right and he's exceeding expectations a little bit, you're going to be very happy. And potentially he moves on. Great. Whatever. That sucks, but I don't think it'll be the Southern Miss. I think this program is a little bit more aligned, and he's a guy that I think is a little bit more committed to the future, of this program that will be seen in the recent coach. So, yeah, first time head coach, questionable in terms of program administration history with their head coaches. Yeah, I'm still excited about this. Our Marshall fans, let us know how you feel. Obviously, we've read stuff online. We've seen stuff talking to you guys, but I want to hear from your thoughts, and hopefully maybe we convinced you one way or another. And obviously, hopefully you're excited, come the fall and spring practice and summer training camps and, official visit seasons coming up for Marshall. So obviously it's a big time right now to be part of the Thundering Herd.